All right, welcome to week 5, lecture 2. In the last lecture, we attempted to make robust our Christology in light of our conversation with Eric Law and its implications for cross-cultural ministry. Thus far, we've been attempting to understand the limitations of our hermeneutic horizons and the impact of our culture on our social imaginations. This turn toward Christology now begins to lead us into a deeper consideration of the ways in which cross-cultural engagement affects the practice of ministry, evangelism, mission, and our leadership within ministry in cross-cultural and multicultural spaces. Written as a good Episcopal, Law, near the end of his book, makes the case for a strong theology of liturgy as a means through which we can move from a person-centered approach of ministry to a form-centered approach to ministry. Now, I can absolutely appreciate the move to liturgy and the emphasis on liturgy as a means of appropriating a common sense of the move of the Spirit throughout the liturgy, regardless of the cultural setting. However, this move gives rise to another set of questions, and I hope that as you read the literature in your master's program, that you are learning to enter into dialogue and conversation with the authors, not just simply accepting what the author has to say. First, who are those that are given the responsibility of crafting that liturgy? And if it's a liturgy of prayers and songs and liturgical readings that have been shaped by a Western tradition extending 200 to 300 years, then do those liturgies faithfully speak to and for the diversity of global believers? And aren't we stepping all over the kind of theology that Law was defending in his cross versus resurrection approach discussed in the previous lecture? Does the worship gathering need to be the primary locus of unity within the multicultural communities? And are we merely exporting forms of cultural hegemony into new contexts that don't fit with that particular set of liturgical practices? I would suggest that it is form-centered ministry that has often drawn the critique of missiologists that have sought forms of ministry and evangelism that are more conducive and sensitive to indigenous populations within different cultural settings. Here is the claim that I'm making in this lecture. George Hunter III and John Finney, among others, have described in a variety of texts that what made the Irish movement of Christianity flourish in the ministry of St. Patrick and those that followed him was that it was neither person-centered or form-centered, but instead mission-centered. This contrasted against the Roman means of evangelism as described by the same authors is another form of cultural hegemony that ultimately diminishes the organic, indigenous, diverse, dynamic nature of cross-cultural engagement. That a robust Christology of mission, wedded with a cross-cultural fluency and one's willingness to stand among and not over those being reached, demands a contextualized evangelism, discipleship, and empowerment for mission. Now let's reverse order look at these. First off, starting with the Christology of mission. It is essential that we understand this, and that's why we started with that in the previous lecture. The church in a cross-cultural setting must understand the nature of the good news being proclaimed and must be competent to speak the whole gospel, not just portions or pieces. This robust Christology locates its potency in the person of Jesus, in the provenience of the Spirit, and in the promises of the gospel. It is according to Paul, and what we've discussed in previous lectures, that possibility of tearing down the dividing walls that exist between us and them, however you want to define us and them. This robust Christology is also located in the organic, movemental expression of the good news embodied in the early movement of the church. It tended toward a more decentralized understanding of power structures and empowerment of all people for the sake of mission. And though we have personalities, we often discover throughout the text that the movement continues to flourish as mission, even in the absence of those personalities. One can think of Paul's letter, his first letter to the church in the city of Thessalonica, as an example of that. This early, robust Christological movement, anchored in the work of the church, was forced to again and again contextualize the movement as it continued to spread beyond defined cultural, social, economic, geographic, political, and even subcultural boundary markers. Organic in its expression, indigenous in its empowerment, and dynamic in its self-understanding, the church flourished in cross-cultural contexts by living on mission and interpreting each and every context as the next and newest social location for the spread of the good news. This leads to the second point that we want to make. As the church makes the shift from being this organic, dynamic, movemental expression of God's kingdom to the state-endorsed spiritual arm of the political agenda in its Roman form after Constantine, the organic impulses were subordinated to an evangelism that devalued difference, sought the homogeneity we discussed in earlier lectures, and sought to export the gospel not only in potency and promise, but also in a particular form. Evangelism became tied to the imperial form of Roman Christianity with all its structures and cultural hegemony. As it spread throughout what we understand to be Europe, it carried with it the form of imperialism, its structures, systems, rituals, and practices decidedly foreign to these broader contexts. Though structured, well-organized, and formal, the further it moved out from the center of Rome, the less it held together, unless it was held together by coercion and manipulation. Evangelism and mission were tied to the form and not just the content of the message. Establishment mentalities that bleed into our missional frameworks have a way of endorsing structures that diminish the possibilities of local missional imagination and the embodiment of the gospel. Now, against the backdrop of this Roman way, both Hunter and Finney and others have suggested the Celtic form of Christianity given birth in Ireland. Robust in its Christology was early evidence of the organic missional impulses latent in the gospel. St. Patrick, at one time slave in Ireland, returns back to the island years after his departure to serve the island for the sake of the kingdom. God had burdened his heart for the people, and his years on that island had granted him a level of cultural fluency essential in his reach of this multicultural space. He understands the tribal nature, the appreciation and the valuing of nature as a whole, had spent time reflecting on the rituals, behaviors, and the attitudes, and because of that strong, robust Christology, was able to contextualize the good news in a culture deeply foreign to both the Jewish origins of the gospel and the current Roman version. He told the story using illustrations and allusions consistent with their understanding of the world, explaining the Trinity with the use of the clover. He redeemed and rescripted prior rituals, orienting them to their newfound faith. This gave rise to the empowerment model of mission that spread throughout the island, becoming a rapid movement spread through the dynamism of the Spirit, incarnated in the missional communities that bore witness to the central core tenets of the Christian faith, not just in proposition, because these were not a propositional truth kind of people, but through their embodiment in real life relationship, one-on-one, life-on-life activity. Finney writes these words: "The Roman pattern was to set up a skeleton organization and then evangelize. The Celtic pattern was to gather the people and then set up the appropriate framework for them." In this sense, one might ask, is it less person-centered or form-centered in multicultural ministry and a much more mission-centered focus that bears the potency of the movement as a whole? I believe that the robust Christology will drive us in this direction, seeking to avoid the imposition of structures and systems on the other, but to stand with the other in meaningful ways, allowing the latent potency of the gospel to be unearthed in dynamic and culturally relevant ways. I like what Finney goes on to say about evangelism in our current multicultural world. "The best modern evangelism goes where people are and listens, binds together prayer and truth, celebrates the goodness and complexity of life, as well as judging the sinfulness of evil, and sees truth as something to be done and experienced as well as to be intellectually believed. It walks with humility." Okay, so far in this set of lectures, we've discussed the imperative of a robust Christology within a cross-cultural ministering setting. And by robust, we mean full, holistic approach to the ministry and the work of Jesus. This robust Christology enables us to stand with dynamic, movemental tradition of the church and unleashing its potency in organic, indigenous, and dynamic ways. Meaning that the form of our multicultural settings is less important than the mission that serves as the collaborative impulse of unity and connectedness. All of this leads to our final lecture for this week, which is what do you do with the term power and how is that applied to missional leadership?